The avoidant encountered you expecting to engage the familiar dynamic they successfully maintained with previous partners, expecting to establish a comfortable defended position where they controlled engagement level through their withdrawal, where they received relationship benefits without providing adequate reciprocation, where they maintained autonomy while accessing your consistent presence, where they determined relationship progression through their resistance while you accommodated their limitations. They expected you would pursue when they withdrew, providing them with validation and maintained connection without requiring their vulnerable engagement. They expected you would tolerate their patterns while hoping for improvement, allowing them to maintain a defended, comfortable position without facing consequences that would necessitate change. They expected you would sacrifice your needs, adjusting expectations downward to match their limited capacity, ensuring the relationship continued despite their inadequacy. Yet you demonstrated specific qualities and established specific boundaries that prevented them from maintaining their usual defended, comfortable dynamic. This was demonstrated through your responses to their patterns, through the standards you maintained despite their resistance, through the self-protection you implemented when their behavior fell below acceptable levels, through a strength that appeared as patience, yet proved to be a choice rather than weakness when you eventually established definitive consequences. They recognized relatively early that you were different from previous partners who allowed them complete control. They recognized you possessed clarity about your worth that would not allow indefinite tolerance of inadequate treatment and possessed boundaries that would eventually impose costs on their patterns. Even while you demonstrated initial patience, you possessed the capacity to leave, which meant their usual strategy of minimal effort would not sustain the relationship indefinitely, as minimal effort had sustained previous relationships. This recognition that they could not have their way with you created a specific crisis in their defended psychology. It created anxiety that they might lose a valuable relationship if they continued usual patterns. It created tension between their defended resistance to change and their desire to maintain access to an exceptional partner. It created internal conflict between their defended comfortable patterns and their recognition that those patterns would eventually cost them the relationship with you. The recognition manifested through their behavior, showing they knew you were different. It manifested through moments where they provided slightly more effort than usual, suggesting they recognized you required more than their baseline minimal provision. Through expressions of anxiety about losing you, indicating they understood you would not tolerate their patterns indefinitely. Through occasional defensive anger when you establish boundaries, revealing their frustration that usual manipulation tactics proved ineffective with you. Yet, recognizing they could not have their way with you proved insufficient to generate genuine change, because recognition alone does not restructure defensive patterns, requiring therapeutic work to address. It proved insufficient because their defended psychology prioritized protecting the defensive structure over doing the vulnerable work that sustaining a relationship with you would have required. It proved insufficient because short-term defended comfort exceeded their capacity to sacrifice comfort for long-term relationship benefit with an exceptional partner. They chose their patterns over choosing you, chose maintaining defended control, even knowing control would eventually cost them the relationship, chose defended autonomy, even recognizing autonomy came at the price of losing a valuable partnership, chose a familiar, comfortable, defended position. Even understanding that comfortable position proved incompatible with sustaining a relationship with a person who would not allow them to have their way through indefinite tolerance of inadequate treatment. Your exceptional qualities and established boundaries prevented you from providing that tolerance, regardless of how much they wanted you to accommodate their defended limitations. You had a self-awareness they couldn't manipulate. You saw the patterns before they fully formed. The avoidant relies on specific manipulation tactics that operate most effectively with partners who lack awareness of avoidant patterns. They rely on partners interpreting withdrawal as a busy schedule rather than recognizing defended deactivation, on partners accepting inconsistency as circumstantial rather than identifying a strategic pattern, on partners believing defended explanations rather than perceiving the defended function behind behaviors. Previous partners may have tolerated patterns for extended periods because they did not recognize patterns as patterns, did not understand withdrawal served a defensive function rather than reflecting legitimate external demands, did not identify inconsistency as attachment-related deactivation rather than accepting presented explanations about stress or overwhelm, did not perceive the strategic element in how patterns maintained avoidance's defended, comfortable position while preventing the relationship from progressing toward deeper intimacy. Yet you possess psychological awareness that prevented their usual manipulation from operating effectively. You possessed an understanding of avoidant attachment patterns that allowed you to recognize their behaviors as defendedly strategic rather than as circumstantial or personality-based. You possess the capacity to identify patterns emerging rather than requiring extended time to recognize problematic dynamics. You possessed a framework for understanding that withdrawal and inconsistency serve a defensive function, protecting against intimacy rather than reflecting their claims about external circumstances or natural personality. Your awareness manifested through your responses that indicated perception, manifested through comments that named their patterns accurately, through questions that revealed you understood the defended function behind behaviors, through boundaries that specifically addressed attachment-related dynamics rather than accepting surface explanations. The avoidant recognized your awareness through specific interactions that revealed you could not be easily manipulated. When they withdrew, claiming stress or overwhelm, you demonstrated understanding this was a defended response to intimacy rather than accepting the external stress explanation. You demonstrated this through statements acknowledging their pattern rather than through pursuing them anxiously, as less aware partners would pursue when they provided inconsistent availability. You identified this as a deactivation pattern rather than accepting their explanations about a busy schedule, identified through naming the pattern or through establishing boundaries around inconsistency rather than accommodating indefinitely. When they created distance after periods of closeness, you recognize this as defended regulation of intimacy rather than believing their justifications. You recognize this through your lack of self-blame and through your maintenance of your worth rather than questioning whether you caused their withdrawal. Your pattern recognition particularly prevented them from using confusion as a manipulation tool. Avoidants often rely on keeping partners confused about relationship status, about their feelings, about what behaviors mean. They rely on confusion keeping partners stuck, analyzing and hoping rather than recognizing patterns and protecting themselves. Confused partners remain focused on trying to understand avoidant behavior, trying to determine what they did wrong, trying to figure out how to make the relationship work. They remain in a position of pursuing and accommodating while the avoidant maintains control through keeping the partner uncertain and off balance. Your awareness eliminated the confusion that manipulation depends upon. It eliminated it through your accurate understanding of what patterns meant, through your recognition of the defended function, through your refusal to remain in a confused, pursuing position that pattern recognition allowed you to exit. The awareness also manifested through your refusal to accept their reframing of your legitimate concerns. When you expressed hurt about their withdrawal, they attempted to reframe your hurt as your excessive neediness, attempted to make you question whether your needs were reasonable rather than accepting their withdrawal was inadequate behavior. When you established boundaries around their inconsistency, they attempted to reframe boundaries as your controlling behavior, attempted to position your self-protection as problematic rather than acknowledging their patterns necessitated your boundaries. When you named their patterns, they attempted to reframe your accurate observations as your overthinking or your bringing relationship baggage, attempted to invalidate your perception rather than facing that your perception accurately identified their defended strategies. Yet your awareness prevented these reframing attempts from succeeding in making you doubt your perception or your worth. You maintained clarity that your needs were legitimate rather than accepting their characterization of needs as excessive. You maintained understanding that your boundaries were appropriate self-protection rather than accepting their positioning of boundaries as controlling. You maintained confidence in your accurate pattern recognition rather than doubting your perception when they attempted to invalidate observations. This maintained clarity prevented them from using gaslighting and reframing tactics that work with less aware partners who can be made to doubt their perception and their worth when the avoidant refuses to acknowledge patterns and instead attacks the partner's character or mental health. Understanding that your self-awareness prevented manipulation allows recognition that they identified you as a threat to their usual defended, comfortable dynamic early in the relationship. Your awareness meant they could not maintain you in a confused, pursuing position that usually allows them control. Your pattern recognition meant they could not use standard manipulation tactics without you identifying and naming what they were doing. Your maintained clarity about your worth and your needs meant they could not make you doubt yourself in ways that would allow them to continue patterns without facing your boundaries and your accurate observations. They knew they could not have their way with you. They knew they could not manipulate you into indefinite tolerance, could not keep you confused and pursuing, could not make you doubt your legitimate needs and your accurate perception of their defended inadequacy. You matched their unavailability instead of chasing. This destroyed their sense of power. The avoidant maintains power and control in relationships through their defended unavailability that triggers the partner's pursuit. They maintain it through withdrawal that generates the partner's anxiety and pursuing behaviors. Through inconsistency that keeps the partner uncertain and working to secure the relationship. Through emotional distance that creates the partner's efforts to achieve closeness and connection. The power dynamic depends on an asymmetry where the avoidant controls engagement through their unavailability while the partner pursues, attempting to restore connection. It depends on the avoidant being the person who determines when contact occurs, who decides what level of intimacy is tolerated, who controls relationship progression through their resistance that the partner works to overcome through increasing pursuit and accommodation. Previous partners likely responded to avoidant unavailability with predictable pursuit that maintained the power dynamic. They responded to withdrawal by reaching out anxiously, trying to restore connection, responded to inconsistency by working harder to secure the relationship and to prove their value, responded to emotional distance by increasing their own emotional expression and vulnerability, hoping to generate reciprocal openness. This pursuing response to unavailability served the avoidant's defended needs perfectly. It served them by validating their worth through the partner's continued pursuit despite inadequate reciprocation, served by maintaining their control through the partner's behavior remaining predictable and manageable, served by allowing them to regulate intimacy through their unavailability, knowing the partner would continue investing regardless of how unavailable they remained. Yet you responded to their unavailability with matching unavailability rather than with pursuit. You responded to withdrawal by creating your own distance rather than by anxiously seeking to restore connection. Responded to inconsistency by becoming less available rather than by working harder to secure the relationship. Responded to emotional distance by maintaining your own emotional boundaries rather than by increasing vulnerable expression, hoping to trigger their reciprocation. Your matched unavailability disrupted their expected dynamic completely. It disrupted by eliminating the pursuit their unavailability was designed to generate. It disrupted by making your behavior unpredictable rather than reliably pursuing. It disrupted by demonstrating you would not continue investing when they demonstrated through unavailability that investment was not adequately valued or reciprocated. The matched unavailability destroyed their sense of power by eliminating their control over the dynamic. When they withdrew expecting you to pursue, your non-pursuit meant withdrawal achieved nothing they intended. It meant they lost access to you rather than creating distance while maintaining your pursuing presence. It meant they could not regulate engagement through withdrawal because withdrawal created mutual distance rather than creating the asymmetric distance where they controlled while you pursued. When they demonstrated inconsistency, expecting you to work harder to secure the relationship, your reduced availability meant inconsistency cost them your presence rather than generating your increased effort. It meant they faced consequences of inconsistency rather than receiving the reward of your pursuit and accommodation. The power destruction particularly manifested through them losing the ability to predict and control your responses. Throughout relationships with previous partners, they could predict that withdrawal generated pursuit, allowing them to manage intimacy through creating distance, knowing the partner would close that distance. They could predict that inconsistency generated the partner's increased effort, allowing them to receive maximum while providing minimum. They could predict that emotional distance generated the partner's vulnerable expression, allowing them to access emotions vicariously without having to reciprocate vulnerability. Your matching unavailability eliminated all predictability, eliminated their confidence that withdrawal would generate your pursuit, that inconsistency would generate your increased effort, that distance would generate your vulnerable approach rather than your protected withdrawal matching their distance. The destroyed power also removed their exit strategy that unavailability usually provided. Avoidants use unavailability as an escape hatch. They use withdrawal to exit when intimacy exceeds tolerance, knowing the partner's pursuit will maintain the relationship, allowing them to return when comfortable. They use inconsistency to maintain flexibility, knowing the partner's accommodation ensures the relationship continues despite their unreliability. Your matching unavailability eliminated this exit strategy by making unavailability actually create distance rather than creating the manageable, contained distance where the partner's pursuit prevented genuine separation. When they withdrew, you allowed withdrawal to create actual separation rather than pursuing to maintain connection. When they were inconsistent, you responded with boundaries that created real consequences rather than with accommodation that made inconsistency cost-free. Understanding that you matched unavailability rather than chasing allows recognition that this response specifically prevented them from having their way with you. Their way depended on your pursuit maintaining connection despite their unavailability. It depended on an asymmetric dynamic where they controlled through withdrawal while you pursued. Your matched unavailability created a symmetric dynamic where unavailability generated mutual distance. It created a situation where they lost the power to control engagement, lost the ability to maintain you pursuing while they withdrew, lost the exit strategy that usually allowed them to regulate intimacy through unavailability without facing real relationship costs. They recognized you would not chase. They recognized this through experiencing that withdrawal did not generate your pursuit, that unavailability did not trigger your anxiety-driven effort to restore connection, that they could not maintain a defended, comfortable position if you refused to participate in the asymmetric dynamic. Their power depended upon their unavailability meeting your reliable pursuit. You required reciprocity instead of accepting crumbs. They'd never encountered that boundary before. The avoidant maintains a defended, comfortable position through providing minimal effort while receiving maximum benefit from partners who accept crumbs. They maintain it through providing occasional attention that partners interpret as meaningful investment, through sporadic emotional availability that partners appreciate as breakthrough moments, through inconsistent presence that partners accommodate while hoping consistency will eventually develop. Previous partners likely accepted crumbs as sufficient. They accepted because crumbs felt like progress compared to complete withdrawal, accepted because scarcity made minimal effort feel valuable, accepted because hope for future improvement allowed tolerating present inadequacy, accepted because confusion about whether expectations were reasonable made them doubt whether they deserved more than the crumbs the avoidant provided. The crumb acceptance served the avoidant's defended needs by allowing them to maintain a relationship without adequate reciprocation. It allowed them to receive the partner's consistent presence and emotional support while providing only minimal, sporadic engagement. It allowed them to access relationship benefits without the vulnerable investment that a reciprocal partnership would require. It allowed them to keep the partner invested through providing just enough to maintain hope without providing enough to actually meet the partner's legitimate needs for consistency and emotional availability. The dynamic created an asymmetric relationship where the partner provided maximum, consistent presence, emotional availability, patience, accommodation, effort to maintain connection, while the avoidant provided minimum, occasional contact, sporadic emotional expression, inconsistent availability, minimal effort that felt significant only because scarcity made any effort appear valuable. Yet you required genuine reciprocity rather than accepting crumbs as sufficient. You required it through establishing clear standards about what acceptable partnership included, required through boundaries that imposed consequences when behavior fell below standards, required through willingness to protect yourself when reciprocity was not provided rather than continuing to accept inadequate treatment while hoping improvement would eventually occur. Your requirement for reciprocity manifested through specific responses to their crumb offerings that demonstrated crumbs were insufficient. When they provided occasional attention after extended withdrawal, you did not respond with gratitude suggesting attention was adequate. You responded with boundaries indicating that occasional attention after withdrawal was not an acceptable pattern. When they offered sporadic emotional availability, you did not treat this as a breakthrough moment. You identified this as their minimum that fell far below the consistent emotional engagement actual partnership required. The reciprocity requirement particularly manifested through you maintaining your standards, even when maintaining standards meant the relationship might end. Previous partners may have lowered standards to maintain the relationship. They lowered by accepting that the avoidant could not provide consistency, so inconsistency should be tolerated. Lowered by believing the avoidant's defended limitations meant their minimal effort was the maximum they could provide, deserving acceptance. Lowered by convincing themselves that crumbs were sufficient because expecting more was unrealistic, given the avoidant's attachment patterns. Yet you maintained that genuine partnership required reciprocal effort regardless of the avoidant's defended limitations. You maintained that you deserved a partner who provided consistent presence, emotional availability, and reliable follow-through, rather than accepting that avoidant limitations meant you should accept treatment falling below relationship standards. The maintained standards created a specific crisis for the avoidant because the standards meant they would lose the relationship if they continued providing only crumbs. Previous relationships continued despite their minimal effort because partners accepted crumbs. Continued because acceptance meant the avoidant faced no consequences, requiring them to choose between increasing effort or losing the relationship. Your standards imposed this choice, imposed by making clear that crumbs were insufficient, that relationship continuation required genuine reciprocity, that you would protect yourself through leaving if reciprocity was not provided. The imposed choice threatened their defended, comfortable position because the position depended on partners accepting crumbs, allowing them to maintain a relationship without adequate effort. The reciprocity requirement also prevented them from using intermittent reinforcement as a manipulation tactic. Avoidants often use intermittent reinforcement, providing occasional good treatment among predominant inadequate treatment to keep partners hooked, hoping for more good moments while tolerating predominant inadequacy. The occasional good moments feel significant because scarcity makes any positive attention feel valuable. They create hope that good moments indicate potential for the relationship to become consistently good. They keep partners pursuing and accommodating, hoping to generate more good moments through their continued effort and patience. Your requirement for reciprocity prevented intermittent reinforcement from working by maintaining the standard that occasional good moments were insufficient, by identifying that the predominant pattern was inadequate, regardless of occasional exceptions, by refusing to organize the relationship around hoping occasional good moments would become a consistent pattern. Understanding that you required reciprocity allows recognition that this boundary was an unfamiliar threat to their usual dynamic. They had never encountered a partner who maintained standards requiring genuine reciprocal effort. They had encountered partners who accepted crumbs, who lowered standards to maintain the relationship, who tolerated predominant inadequacy, hoping occasional good moments indicated potential. Your requirement that they provide genuine reciprocity or lose the relationship created a choice they had not previously faced, created pressure to either increase effort to a reciprocal level or face losing a valuable partner to standards they could not manipulate you into lowering. They knew they could not have their way with you. They knew they could not maintain you accepting crumbs, could not convince you to lower standards, could not use intermittent reinforcement to keep you hooked while providing predominantly inadequate treatment. That genuine reciprocity requirement identified inadequacy regardless of occasional better moments. You didn't need them to feel complete. That self-sufficiency was incomprehensible to their ego. The avoidant maintains an inflated ego and sense of importance through relationships with partners who demonstrate need for them, through partners whose pursuit suggests the avoidant is valuable enough to chase, whose tolerance of patterns suggests the avoidant is important enough that inadequate treatment should be accepted to maintain access, whose emotional dependence on the relationship suggests the avoidant provides essential value that the partner cannot find elsewhere or cannot generate independently. Previous partners likely demonstrated this need in ways that validated the avoidant's ego. They demonstrated it through anxious pursuit when the avoidant withdrew, suggesting they needed the avoidant's presence. Demonstrated through continued investment despite inadequate reciprocation, suggesting the relationship with the avoidant was so valuable that inadequacy should be tolerated. Demonstrated through organizing life around the relationship, suggesting the avoidant was central to their well-being and their happiness. The demonstrated need served the avoidant's defended ego by confirming they were the more valuable partner in the dynamic. It confirmed this through the partner needing them more than they needed the partner, through the partner pursuing while they withdrew, through the partner sacrificing and accommodating while they maintained a defended, comfortable position, providing minimum. The confirmation protected the ego from facing their inadequacy by positioning inadequacy as tolerable because they were valuable enough that the partner would accept inadequate treatment to maintain the relationship. The ego protection allowed them to maintain the defended belief they were a good enough partner despite patterns. Allowed this through interpreting the partner's continued presence, despite inadequacy, as proof. Inadequacy was acceptable rather than recognizing the partner's continued presence, reflected the partner's excessive tolerance rather than reflecting their adequate partnership. Yet you demonstrated self-sufficiency that contradicted their ego-protecting narrative about being needed. You demonstrated it through maintaining a full, independent life that did not require the relationship for completeness, through emotional stability that did not depend on their presence for regulation, through a clear sense of worth that did not need their validation for maintenance, through a capacity for happiness that existed independently of relationship status or their treatment. Your self-sufficiency manifested through specific behaviors that revealed you did not need them. When they withdrew, you engaged with your independent life rather than demonstrating distress, requiring their return to restore your stability. When they were unavailable, you pursued your own goals and interests rather than organizing time around hoping for their contact. When the relationship was struggling, you maintained your well-being rather than demonstrating that relationship struggles devastated you, requiring relationship repair to restore your functioning. The self-sufficiency particularly threatened their ego because it meant you could leave. You could leave because you did not need the relationship for your completeness. Could leave because your well-being did not depend on maintaining connection with them. Could leave because your independent life provided sufficient satisfaction that the relationship was an enhancement rather than a necessity. Previous partners who needed them could not easily leave because leaving meant losing an essential source of worth, happiness, or stability that the relationship provided. Yet your self-sufficiency meant leaving was a viable option. It meant you could choose to protect yourself through leaving without devastating consequences to your well-being. Meant you could prioritize your standards and your needs over maintaining the relationship because the relationship was not essential to your functioning or your happiness.